What is God? At first, this may seem like an easy question. God is the creator, he's the beginning, he is the reason everything exists, so on and so on. While this is all true, it's not a very clear definition of what God is, and literally every single religion can claim that God is some sort of creator. Whether that is Ahura Mazda according to Zoroastrians, the pagan gods in the mythologies that you know, such as Chaos for the Greeks or Odin for the Norse. I mean, you yourself probably have an idea of what God is, with the most common view today being the triune God of Christianity. While all of these religions have their idea of what God is, it is all very different and inconsistent across the board. Whether that is the polytheism of paganism, the dualism of Zoroastrianism, or the monotheism of the Abrahamic faith. This leads to different interpretation of what God is, such as if God has a body, if God has emotions and feelings, or how God interacts with creation. That's why it's important today to establish what theology God operates under, and here I'll be using the God of classical theism to make my point. Now, what is classical theism? Classical theism is the position that you are probably the most familiar with, as it is the position held by the Abrahamic religions. This is the position that God is an unchangeable, maximally great being. This being is the necessary being for all of creation. Due to being a maximally great being, God has characteristics such as omniscience, omnibenevolence, and very relevant to this video, omnipotent. It is also important to know that a key part of classical theism is divine simplicity, which is the position that God does not possess his attributes, but he is his attributes. For example, God does not merely love, but instead God is love itself. Under this framework, God does not merely follow the laws of logic. The laws of logic emanate from God himself as they are reflections of his unchanging mind. I guess it can be said that God follows the laws of logic not because they constrict him, but because they just are how he exists. Now this is where the big question comes in. Can God create a rock so heavy he cannot lift it? Many atheists see that God cannot do the illogical as a contradiction with one of his attributes, that being omnipotence. The argument often goes that if God can create a rock he cannot lift, then he is not omnipotent as he cannot lift the rock. However, if God can't create a rock he cannot lift, then right off the bat, God is just some weak little being that is not omnipotent. So whatever religion they are arguing against is automatically not true. You know, while that's cool and all, but where does Britain tie into all of this? Parliament. The most powerful institution on earth. Literally. That literally being only in theory. I think it's clear to the most uneducated simpleton that Britain's constitutional system is a mess. Wait, did I just say constitution? Britain has one of those? Well, no. But also yes. You may think that I'm speaking about the Magna Carta when I talk about Britain's constitution. But no, you are wrong. Britain doesn't actually have a neatly codified constitution written in one place like that of America. Instead, what constitution means is the system of rules in place that govern how the United Kingdom is run. And these generally developed over time. The most important of these rules is the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, or supremacy, take your pick. They both mean the same thing. Parliamentary supremacy finds its origins in the English Bill of Rights in 1689, where Parliament basically said that it's the supreme authority in the United Kingdom. The monarch technically has veto powers, but as a part of Parliament, it is an internal, not an external restraint. The main principle behind parliamentary sovereignty is that Parliament is omnipotent. See where I'm going with this? There have been three main principles that have developed out of parliamentary sovereignty. These aren't written down as legal rules, but have instead simply developed from the meaning of what the omnipotence of Parliament is, such as historic common law. A.V. Dicey said that these three main principles are as follows. First, Parliament has the ability to make any law it wishes. If Parliament makes a law that all the people in the streets of Paris have to shave their heads, it is still a valid law made by Parliament, even if enforcing it might be slightly difficult. The second principle is that there is no body of authority above Parliament. This means that all the laws Parliament makes cannot be challenged, whether by courts or independent institutions, and nothing can be forced onto Parliament by anything other than Parliament itself. The third principle is that Parliament has the authority to unmake any law it wants. All the law in the United Kingdom is equal in status, meaning there is no law Parliament could not repeal without a simple vote, and it is not possible for Parliament to bind itself. This is different to countries where the Constitution has a special status, where repealing the law in the Constitution is much more difficult than a simple vote. You're probably wondering how there isn't a contradiction in this view. If you take the principles at their plain, ordinary meaning, it appears that there would be. However, the orthodox view, no, not that orthodox, posited by Henry Wade solves this issue, It acknowledges that the source of parliamentary sovereignty isn't a legal source, instead it is an unchangeable fact arising out of Britain's political system. In other words, parliamentary sovereignty is an ongoing property of Parliament, rather than a static property. If the core nature of parliamentary sovereignty was a static property, it would imply that it is changeable. Parliament would be able to remove its power, but the core idea of parliamentary sovereignty cannot change due to the very nature of the English political system. This satisfies the second principle of parliamentary sovereignty, as it implies that if Parliament did remove its own power, there is a body that is not Parliament that is keeping Parliament's powers limited. If there is such a body, then the second principle cannot be true. But as there is literally no entity that can keep Parliament restricted, the second principle is true. Since the second principle is true, nothing outside of Parliament can keep its own powers restricted, meaning that Parliament would not be able to destroy its own supremacy, as there is nothing that can keep it destroyed. As the power of Parliament is an ongoing power, it means that the principles apply to Parliament constantly. Therefore, Parliament can make any law it wants, and it can always unmake any law it wants, in compatibility with the first and third principles. Therefore, Parliament in theory can make a law that binds itself, but as it always has the ability to unmake any law, it can unmake any law at any time, even if bound by it. The bind still exists, it is just a voluntary one, not a legal one. Parliament can choose to adhere to it, but as it always has the power to unmake any law, it can unmake the law that binds it. I think it's decently obvious how this all links back to God. God also has the property of being omnipotent, and his omnipotence naturally follows the same principles. No being in creation can alter God's nature or restrict God, but God himself, so nothing can alter God's omnipotence. As God's properties are essential to him, and God is eternal, so are his properties. So his property of omnipotence is a permanent, unchanging, and ongoing property by his very nature. God also has the power to create anything and to unmake anything. It is true that God cannot create a logical contradiction, as God cannot act against his own nature, just as Parliament cannot act against its own sovereignty. But there is a situation where God can create a rock he cannot lift, just as Parliament can create a law that binds itself, voluntarily adhere to that binding as true, and then revoke it anyway. God can do the same thing. God can create a rock that he truly cannot lift, but as his omnipotence is ongoing, he can choose to be able to lift it anyway. This is a voluntary binding on God that adheres to it, and while it is a true bind, it is one that he, through his own omnipotence, can remove. Therefore, to answer the question of if God can create a rock so heavy he cannot lift, yes, but he can choose to lift it anyway.